Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of week 2 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist. We are talking about the Protagoras, and we continue to talk about the so-called unity of the virtues. There is a groundbreaking paper by Gregory Vlastos from 1972 on this issue and topic and puzzle in the Protagoras and beyond. And today I want to talk a little bit about this paper. The paper has been widely debated. Many aspects of what Gregory Vlastos is saying have been rejected, but some of it has become a kind of common ground in the literature, and it is important for us to think it through. Now, one key notion that Vlastos uses has become almost universally accepted, namely the notion of interentailment. And that is the view that what the unity of virtues really says is that for someone to have one of the virtues, they must have all the virtues, or in the language of parts and wholes, for someone to have a part of virtue, they need to have all of virtue, the whole of virtue. And this notion of interentailment says that the virtues entail each other. For you to have one of them, you must have all of them. Or for you to have one part of virtue, you must have virtue as a whole. That is Vlastos's upshot in his paper. And that, I would suggest, is a highly compelling reading of what the unity of the virtues is saying. An alternative and much more revisionist reading would be to say that Socrates' and Plato's view here does not permit any kind of differentiation between, let's say, justice, moderation, courage, wisdom, and so on. That really all of those qualities are simply identified with each other. That would be a much more counterintuitive, maybe too counterintuitive, entirely uncompelling reading. But there are moments in the text where it could seem that that is what Socrates is saying. And in order to solve that puzzle, as it were, Vlastos introduces two notions which have become kind of stock vocabulary in the scholarship of Plato, and which, as you're thinking through this, you should also think through. And those are the notions of self-predication and so-called Pauline predication, where Pauline refers to the Gospel of Paul. So let me explain a little bit. When Socrates aims to defend his own stance in conversation with Protagoras, the first thing he says, well, do you admit, you Protagoras, that justice, piety, moderation, and wisdom, and so on, those parts of virtue, that each of them is a thing, a pragma? And it's not an easy question what that amounts to, but Protagoras does not question it at that moment, and he just says yes. Now, the next thing that Socrates says then is, well, so let's look at each of these things. Justice is just, it would seem, and piety is pious. Do you admit that? And Protagoras says, yes, sure. And that is almost presented as a rhetorical question, like, how could we not think that justice is just? At the same time, it may seem that this is a fairly difficult idea to understand. And then Socrates continues and says, and wouldn't you also say that justice is pious and that the pious is just? And again, that is not an easy thing to understand. So those are the claims that I want to look at now a little bit with the help of the vocabulary that Vlastos introduced. So the claims are justice is just, piety is pious, and then justice is pious, the pious is just. Vlastos discusses the first set of claims, justice is just and piety is pious, as if the Protagoras already contained discussion of Plato's so-called forms. Now, nowadays scholars do not accept that, or at least for the most part. So what Vlastos is saying here is a little bit not entirely an option from the kind of point of view of bigger commitments that scholars tend to have nowadays. But I'll just sort of quickly explain what the thought is, because it is nevertheless a helpful step along the way here. So the idea is that, say, in the Republic, you have the form of the good, and the thought is that all good things are good by virtue of their relation to the form of the good. Say the good toaster is good on account of how it relates to the form of the good. The good person is good on account of how it relates to the form of the good. Now, similar to how in the Protagoras, Socrates says justice is just, it would seem that we could say the form of the good is good. And if you think, as Vlastos thought, that the Protagoras is talking about forms, then it could seem that what Socrates is saying is that the form of justice is just, or the form of the pious is pious. Now, the problem with this, according to Vlastos, and that seems compelling, is that this kind of so-called self-predication, where you predicate, as it were, the form of itself, the good is good, the just is just, the form of the pious is pious, this so-called self-predication wouldn't seem to work across the board for Plato's forms. Vlastos thinks that there is a form of motion in Plato's philosophy. And then if you were to use self-predication here, then you would get the form of motion moves. But we already know, as it were, if we know a little bit about Plato's metaphysics, that the forms do not move. So across the board, self-predication seems to be a puzzling and problematic thing. Now, Vlastos kind of understands that as part of the puzzle that he wants to solve in his interpretation of the Protagoras. So he moves on to the second set of claims. The just is pious, or justice is pious, and the pious is just. And he says, really what's going on here is not an identification. It's not as if Plato says justice and piety are the same, or the just and the pious are identical. Rather, what he is saying is, and now he coins this expression of a Pauline predication, which he is saying functions similar to how a passage in the Gospel of Paul works, where it is said that charity is kind. And really, the quote is longer, it's on the handout, but that is kind of a short version of it. And Vlastos says what is being said here is not that charity and kindness are the same thing. We are not identifying them. Rather, we are saying that those who are charitable are also kind. And that we can express also in the language of coextension. We can say someone who has the virtue of charity also has the virtue of kindness. And that, according to Vlastos, is the key to how we should interpret the unity of the virtues. Namely, when Socrates asks Protagoras, is it the case that for someone to have one part of virtue, they need to have the whole? The plan is not to identify all the virtues with each other, but the plan is to, or the idea is to say that the virtues are coextensive. For one person to have one of the virtues, she must also have the other virtues. And Vlastos thinks that also kind of solves his puzzle about self-predication. But since we think that the forms, or I think that the forms don't even figure in the Protagoras, we don't need that dimension of his paper. What we need, however, is this idea that really what Socrates is proposing is not the hugely implausible idea that all the good qualities that we ascribe to people simply come to the same and are identical with each other. Rather, the thought is that for someone to genuinely and fully have one of these qualities, she also needs to have the others.